this morning is a continuation of what we heard last Sunday, parables about the kingdom of heaven. A couple of things jumped out at me that I want to share with you before I really get into my homily. First, we are hearing parts of chapter 13, verses 24 to 30, and then we jump to verse 36. Whenever several verses are skipped over, I always wonder why and pick up a Bible to see what was left out. In this case, it was 2 more parables about the kingdom of heaven. Where our lead parable today was about wheat and weeds, the parables we don't hear are about the mustard seed being the smallest of seeds, but growing to be the greatest of trees, and the other is about the use of yeast in leavening flour. Matthew uses a lot of parables in his gospel, to the point where it seems as though Jesus only spoke in parables when he was speaking with the crowds, and then privately explaining them to the disciples. Just last Sunday, we heard another parable about the sower. And today's reading is a continuation of that same set of teachings about the kingdom of heaven, as is much of chapter 13. Now, I was taken back to my days as a young Catholic schoolgirl, as I read, "And they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." This is about the final punishment known as hell, which we were warned about in Catholic school many, many times. The descriptions of hell seemed so vivid to me and were strong reasons for me always to do what the nuns taught. And then there was also purgatory. When you died, if you weren't quite good enough for heaven and not bad enough for hell, there was always purgatory, where you could be placed for an indefinite period of time as you awaited your final judgment. The author of Matthew uses rather direct descriptions of the punishment awaiting those who do evil, yet uses metaphors, parables, for describing the kingdom of heaven. Perhaps if we have a moment this afternoon, we can read over the full chapter 13 and contemplate all the parables about the kingdom and what they mean to us. This morning's parable is about the wheat and the weeds. Farming is a hard way of life, but it also must be gratifying to work the earth and see the fruits of your labor. Of course, forces of nature can make that difficult. Drought, heavy rains, insects, weeds can interfere with producing a good crop. Our farmer in the parable appears to be patient and wise. Although the workers of the field wanted to get rid of the weeds immediately so that only the good seed would remain, the sower realized the benefit of patience in waiting until the harvest to do the separating. The weeds and the wheat would grow side by side. So how is that like the kingdom of heaven? Is it about leaving judgment about good and evil to God? Is it about the pitfalls of passing judgment before seeing the final result of one's labor? Is it about good and evil existing side by side and finding a way to coexist? We seem to have all kinds of ways to separate people from one another. Be it perceived criminals being placed in prisons, immigrants and refugees being separated, kept apart from those of us who belong here, and although not so prevalent as it was in the past, placing those with mental illness into facilities to keep them away from those who are normal. The more separation there is, I think, the more richness we tend to lose in living only with those we deem good seed. All through history, there have been examples of separating, even killing the other. Our treatment of Native Americans, the Holocaust, Chinese internment camps, refugees around the world, religious persecutions, racial divides, and it goes on. What our sower was teaching was to let the weeds and the wheat grow together and wait until the harvest to determine what is kept and what is tossed. But maybe he was seeing more. Maybe by letting the weeds and wheat grow together, they would learn from each other and influence each other in ways not considered. Perhaps they would get to understand the other's point of view. Perhaps find a way to live in harmony together and wait for the one more qualified than us to pass judgment. The death of George Floyd has begun bringing people from all sides to the table to talk about issues that were only talked about with similarly minded individuals in the past. Among them, Black Lives Matter and police brutality. And passing judgment too quickly is part of both issues. I want to share with you what I think is a great example of passing judgment too quickly that I came across some years ago. Some of you may be familiar with Nadia Bowles-Weber, a Lutheran minister and author of several books, including Pastrix, The Cranky, Beautiful Faith of a Sinner and a Saint. Nadia is 6 feet tall, a former stand-up comedian, former substance abuser and addict, and she is covered in tattoos. During her time of addiction and hanging out with those at the bottom of society, she looked around and saw more pain and loss than those suffering knew what to do with. But she also saw God. She saw God among the cynics and alcoholics and those of various sexual orientations. It was in the midst of her own community of those living in the margins that she began to see the gospel, the life-changing reality that God is among the brokenness of our lives, among the weeds as well as the wheat. She felt God calling her to start a church, to be a pastor to the community of which she was a part, a community that was not being reached by any ministry to which they could relate. Nadia became a Lutheran minister and started the House for All Saints and Sinners in 2008 in an area of Denver where the bottom of society lived. And her neighbors came. They came to be a part of a community, to hear the gospel, to be healed. But there were rarely more than 45 people showing up for her Sunday evening services. Nadia dreamed of having at least 70 regulars and was frustrated by the lack of growth. But word of her church began to spread. And in 2011, Nadia was invited to speak to a gathering of 10,000 at an Easter service at the Colorado Amphitheater. That next week after Easter, attendance at the Church for All Saints and Sinners doubled. Nadia knew there would be curiosity seekers showing up once or twice. But what she didn't count on was that they would stay and that they wouldn't look like her regulars. They would be from the mainstream of society. Nadia wanted bigger, but admittedly didn't want different. She was terrified that the edgy, marginalized people whom she had always attracted would now come and see a bunch of people who looked like their parents and think, this isn't for me. Panicked, she called a church meeting of the old and new congregants to talk about the sudden growth and demographic changes in her church. Nadia thought that those who really didn't belong there, the new ones, would select out once they realized it wasn't a place meant for them. It was a place for weeds, not wheat. A few days before that meeting, she had a life-changing kind of conversation with a pastor friend of hers who said, Nadia, you're really good at welcoming a stranger when it's a young transgender person. But sometimes the stranger looks like your mom and dad. And although it angered her at first that her friend was not agreeing with her, she realized just how true that statement was. Nadia went ahead with the meeting. The newer congregants showed up as well as the original group. Among the new folks who spoke was a 73-year-old Episcopal deacon who stood up and said she knew she was a bit older than most of them, but felt that this church was a place where she really could pray and be herself. And then an original member of the church, spoke, saying, as the young transgender kid who was welcomed into this community, I just want to go on record and say that I'm really glad there are people at church now who look like my mom and dad, because I have a relationship with them that I just can't have with my own parents. Nadia's life change was completed, no longer seeing wheat and weeds, but only her siblings. The seeds are planted in all of us, both good and bad. We can influence and we can be influenced. We are all a mixture of wheat and weeds, of holy and unholy, of potentially fruitful and potentially destructive actions and words. Instead of rushing to judgment so we can separate the wheat from the weeds, let's love and live with each other. Instead of trying to figure out who is acceptable and who is not, let's work to accept everyone as a child of God. Let's welcome the stranger, respect the dignity of every human being, and truly live out our baptismal covenant. Amen. And now, John, the choral anthem.